Hello, today we are moving into the 17th century and we are talking about Baroque religion and culture, thus this lovely background here. Um, we are talking about what Restall and Lane call the middle period, the mid-colonial period. So Spanish presence has been in the Americas for over a century now. In some places, generations of people calling themselves Spaniards or españoles, españolas, now have never been to Spain. And Espanol is now understood as a kind of ethnic category. And peninsular is the term that is used to refer to people who actually have come from Spain. And there's a growing sense of identification with America, with America, with America. People think of themselves as Americans. Most of the people who speak that way are people that we would call, that historians have called Creoles, translation of criollo, which in this context means Spanish, people of Spanish descent who were born in the Americas. And this really is the term that people use for themselves. 16th century Spaniards talked about making America. And in the 17th century and 18th century, New World born Spaniards called themselves Americans regularly. So today is going to be a general lecture. I want to introduce you to some general processes and changes in religion, culture, and society in the 17th century as compared to the 16th century. What I'd like to do today is to give you more a sense of the 17th century as kind of a flavor, a texture, a sense of the era, and then we can build on that through some more specific examples in future lectures. So the best way to do that is to talk about what many Latin American intellectuals have identified as Baroque culture, society, and religion. Now, this could be confusing to people who are familiar with Baroque in relationship to European art or literature and music. And this is not because the way that I'm using it is completely unrelated to those cultural forms. It is related, but it is not exactly the same. When I talk about the Baroque age in Latin America, I'm not just referring to art or architecture or literature or music. And I'm not talking about something that's simply borrowed or imported from Europe by in any means or imitated. I'm talking about something that is uniquely American, uniquely Latin American, something that people at the time, as well as Latin American intellectuals of later years and later generations, felt actually represented a kind of deeply authentic expression of Latin America becoming Latin American. So Latin America becoming Latin America is in fact a useful concept to think with. I think it's useful as a way of framing the entire history of the colonial era, but it's particularly useful, I think, as a way of framing this middle period, the mid-colonial period, or the long 17th century, by which I mean roughly the years between 1580, 1590, and 1730. So the very end of the 16th century up to the very beginning of the 18th century. So first, let me ask you, you won't be able to answer, but to think for a moment, when I say Baroque, what comes to mind? What specific qualities or characteristics? What qualities make something Baroque? So if you want to pause the video and take a moment to reflect on that, that would be great. From the perspective of Spain and the top of the colonial administration, the first half of the 16th century, so before the period we're talking about today, was a time of expansion, a time of triumphant millenarian visions, apocalyptic understandings of time and history. There were ideas about having reached a glorious promised land, a land of gold. There were dreams of a unified Christian Spanish peninsula at the helm of a new Christian Roman Empire that would spread throughout the world. Religion was austere and ascetic. Things were urgent and outwardly focused. The message to the first 12, which were chosen on purpose to be 12, um, Franciscan missionaries sent to the New World, sent to Latin America, was hurry to the task, hurry down from their contemplative space that they existed in Europe, and hurry down to the task, the urgent task of spreading Christianity and converting souls and baptizing and creating a new society. Art in the 16th century was reflective of all of this urgency and austerity and apocalyptic vision. It was stark in many ways. It used simple, relatively simple forms that conveyed a kind of clarity of power and purpose. You've heard me speak about the fact that I think that all of this representation of certainty, representation of the an absolute truth, a sense that the people arriving knew what was right and wrong, and the sense of one true religion, etc., was in some sense an assertion of something that was being created and also in crisis. So I'm not suggesting that this is actually representative of how everybody on the ground felt, but there was a way in which art was calling that into being. Popular Spanish colonial culture was a conquistador culture, had visions of status and visions of this kind of hierarchical culture. It was a medieval culture in many ways, or at least it was representing itself that way, full of lords and dueling contests and celebrations of the figure of the conqueror. But this confidence and triumphant vision does not hold. However, by the end of the 16th century, too much has changed for Spain and in Europe in general for this vision to be very widespread, or even to be what's the word I'm looking for? Aspirational, even to be something that's being called into being in art forms and things. By the start of the 17th century, no one thinks that Spain is going to achieve what the Roman Empire did. No one thinks the world will be united under Christendom anymore. Because the success of the Protestant Reformation has dashed that dream to bits. And in economic terms and in cultural and religious terms, from the view of the top of society looking down or surveying the scene from the perspective of rule makers and those in power in society, the 17th century appears to be a time of retrenchment, of pulling in, of reevaluating, a time of decline in some ways, a time of confusion and disappointment, a time actually when it seems that the fight between good and bad, Christ and the devil, dark and light, that was so urgent in the 16th century has perhaps been lost. And if not lost for good, then it is a dark period, a time when the forces for night and the evil and the devil are stronger, are getting the upper hand. This is what many historians and people thinking about the Baroque in Europe have used. These are the kinds of images and ideas that they've used to describe what produced the kind of art that you see behind you. Although this is Latin American Baroque, and so we could argue that it looks a little different, and it does. But many art historians have talked about a kind of exaggerated, chaotic mixing of art forms as being representative of this kind of worldview. But if this is true, if this is the sort of overwhelming sense of the 17th century, then how do you explain the following? Many Latin American intellectuals, literary figures, and other scholars of culture at the time, and also in periods immediately following, look at this time period as one in which Latin American creativity flourished, a time when the sort of culture of creativity and genuine Americanness, genuine Latin Americanness, comes to be most fully expressed. Lo barroco is a term that is used to identify this kind of Latin American identity. It's a time when the occupied lands of the Western Hemisphere become not Spanish colonies, but their own thing. They become Latin America in the view of these Latin American intellectuals who are speaking about it. They identify this time as a time of improvisation, of creative mixtures, of fluidity, of wild and endless combinations that are rich and elaborate in form, but not without depth of substance. So melancholy and the sublime can go together. Dark and light, good and bad, struggle and celebration, these things can coexist. Contradiction is central to this understanding of Latin American Baroque. In the Baroque, there seems to be a tension between opposites, confusion, mixing of various elements. I want you to think about this as a time of both chaos and creativity, a mixing of various elements. I want you to think of this as a time of both retraction and introspection, as well as a kind of flourishing of inner life, of regional identity, of culture, and even of the economy when we're talking about local economies. The 17th century can be seen as both a time of decline and development in colonial Latin America, a time of fear and a time of reveling in the sublime, a time of crisis and a time of mystical exploration. Sorry about that awkward pause. My computer was about to die. I realized that the plug wasn't plugged in all the way. So I was trying to find the pause button. So with this in mind, that these kinds of contradictions, I want to share with you a puzzle that I've been thinking through for some time, and we have talked about it in class a little bit. How was the religious experience or perspective or cosmology of Europeans affected by their sustained contact with the cosmologies of Native Americans, of indigenous people? How was European Christianity changed in this? It's hard to study because everything we have in terms of written records of the 16th century points to a kind of world of entrenchment of absolutes, a dogmatic insistence on one truth. And yet, common sense would suggest that there must have been an impact for European and Spanish colonial society um, in this kind of extended communication and convivencia of living together with an entirely new set of worldviews and peoples and histories. So I often wonder if there's something about the particular ways that Baroque culture and art and religious expression seemed to take hold in Latin America and was embraced and celebrated and looked different and was embraced and celebrated not just by elite culture, but on a daily local level in society. And I wonder sometimes about whether this might be a clue as to how European or colonial European informed society was impacted um, by sustained contact with indigenous people. So think about the ways that chaos and order were the primary binaries in pre-colonial indigenous cultures in a kind of broad stroke way, and how the celebration of chaos, the celebration of or the understanding that chaotic forces were just as sacred and just as essential and just as intrinsic to forces of nature and forces of the cosmos as were um, as was order. So thinking about that makes me, reflect on the ways that Latin American Baroque seemed to be embraced in a different way than it was in Europe. So, but now let me stop being quite so esoteric and abstract for a moment, and let me talk about some concretes. What was going on in the 17th and the very early 18th centuries that affect the way that religion and culture and art may have been expressed and experienced? How do things look on the ground? So, in terms of the structure of the church first, secularization was more and more solid. If you recall, I spoke about secularization as being the process by which um, parishes, indigenous communities, indigenous parishes, indigenous churches were removed from the jurisdiction of religious orders and given back from the perspective of the way things had been before in Spain and also in the institutional church in general, back to the jurisdiction of the diocesan clergy. If you recall, the church is structured in, there's a way of thinking about the church as being structured in two halves, the Catholic Church. The one half is what I'm calling the diocesan clergy, which is understood as the secular clergy. And secular doesn't mean not religious. It comes from a Latin root that means that secula, that is about in the world. That means to speak to clergy that have lives and activities in the world. So the secular clergy or the diocesan clergy is that part of the institutional church that most people are familiar with when you think about priests and bishops and the Pope, etc. It starts at the top with the Pope, and then there's cardinals, and there's bishops, and there's clergy, and that whole structure, which is a global structure, is the diocesan church. And prior to the arrival in Latin America, the diocesan clergy were who was in charge of parishes. They were pastors. They were the people actually running the churches and performing sacraments and acting as pastors in people's lives. There's another half of the church, which are the religious orders. And so these are the convents, these are the monasteries, so monks and friars and nuns. And that part of the church are organized in religious orders. And religious orders have their own superiors, their own supervisors, their own internal rule. And they are a part of the church, and they do answer to the Pope, but they are not part of that other structure, that bureaucracy, that in the world bureaucracy of the church. And religious orders are called the regular clergy, not because they're ordinary, but because the regula comes from the Spanish root that means rule. So what that signals is that all of these religious orders follow particular rules. So you may have heard of Franciscans or Jesuits or Dominicans, etc. And those are religious orders that follow a particular rule. So for our purposes here, why that's important is that under the Spanish king at a particular moment, the charge of the conversion, the Christian education, and in some senses the kind of bureaucratic organization and the welfare of indigenous people in indigenous towns was given to the charge of these religious orders, and in particular given to the charge of the particular kinds of religious orders that were known as the mendicant orders. And these are orders that took vows of poverty and supported themselves through alms. So these people were not normally pastors. They were not normally in charge of parishes prior to coming to Latin America. And so this was a new role for them. And it was thought that indigenous people would be in better hands with these religious spiritual athletes, these kind of, especially separate from the world, especially pious, in some ways, groups of religious people that were less entangled with politics, that were less a part of the world, that were, for instance, you've heard me talk about the patronato. The patronato was the right that the Pope had given the Iberian kings and queens to appoint bishops, to appoint diocesan clergy. And so in a very real way, the diocesan branch of the church, the secular branch of the church, was underneath the rule of the Spanish crown, was integrated into Spanish rule, Spanish royal authority. These religious orders were separate from that and had devoted themselves to prayer and contemplation and things like that. They were not parish priests. But in here in the early part of Latin America, they were given the charge to be in charge of the Christianization of indigenous communities. But it was always understood that this was going to be temporary. And so the policy was set that at a certain point, all of these missions, all of these areas where the religious orders were in charge of these Indian parishes, a process of secularization was supposed to happen, which meant that it was being transferred to the secular church. The religious orders were supposed to go back to their contemplative lives, go back to their monasteries, and the diocesan clergy was supposed to take over, and these indigenous communities were supposed to be integrated into the larger diocesan structure. And this had a parallel in the ways that encomienda, as a form of rule, as a form of very personal rule, where individual Spaniards would benefit from and were also supposed to be, in some real sense, in charge of the welfare and be the authorities of groups of indigenous people living in a particular area. That was a temporary solution. That was a temporary situation meant to motivate individual Spanish conquistadors to do the kind of exploring and military conquest that was envisioned as needed, and also to stand in as a kind of middle ground of government until more substantial bureaucracy and administration could be established. The idea was that encomenderos would lose after one generation this situation, and indigenous towns would be incorporated into Spanish colonial society and would be a part of colonial governance. There was at this time an understanding of two republics, the República de Indios and República de Españoles. And so there wasn't a sense of two parallel colonial two systems of bureaucracy and governmental apparatus. But nonetheless, the encomenderos were supposed to get out of the way, and indigenous people were supposed to become subjects of the crown, integrated into this colonial system. And the church bureaucracy and the royal bureaucracy and colonial bureaucracy underneath the royal bureaucracy were paralleled in this way. So by the 17th century, more and more encomenderos, yes, had been removed from their immediate kind of rule and authority of indigenous communities. They still existed in many places, but secularization of Indian parishes was more solid, was taking place. It was supposed to happen a lot sooner, but it took a long time to happen. And throughout the 16th century, there are delays and, religious orders arguing that indigenous people are not properly Christianized yet, and so they need more time, etc. But here, by the beginning of the 17th century, secularization had happened to a great degree. So religious orders then were moving into the cities, and they were establishing and bringing their experience and bringing their particular brand of Christianity into Spanish urban spaces. And this was really significant for the spread of Baroque kinds of religiosity and culture, etc. But also there was an establishment of more and more parishes in the rural areas, and the role of bishops became more important. And there was a growth of ecclesiastical courts that more and more people could use in rural areas to directly present petitions when they were having problems and needed problems solved on a local level within families and within communities and things like that. Another element that is different in terms of the structure of the church is the growth of the Inquisition. The Inquisition becomes more visible at this time. I'd like to, in a separate lecture, talk a little bit more about the way that the Inquisition works. We've talked about the Inquisition in relationship to Spain and how it was developed in Spain, and there was also a similar process that happened in Latin America, where in the early period there wasn't the established permanent Inquisition that had by that time happened in Spain and been established and was directly under the rule of the king, under the control of the king. Um, there was a monastic inquisition. There were those kinds of roaming inquisitions where when there was a concern about idolatry, when there was a concern about idolatry was really what was the concern in the early part of the colonial period, and so the Inquisition was responding to concerns about improperly Christianized indigenous people. But very quickly that ended. And as part of some of the laws that happened by the mid 16th century, it was determined that indigenous people were not going to be under the jurisdiction of the Inquisition. They were to be considered permanent neophytes, permanent children in the faith, that they couldn't be expected to get it right, to be spiritually advanced enough to be corrected by the Inquisition. But there was then at that same time an establishment of the actual institution of the Inquisition that was parallel to the Inquisition in Spain. It was not underneath the Inquisition in Spain. So one was established in Mexico and one was established in Peru. And the way that the Inquisition made its presence known, again, was judicial and not executive. So we may think about the Inquisition as being a really powerful presence and investigators going around and rooting out people making mistakes, but that's not really the way that it was. People presented petitions, and in most cases, things never actually went to trial. The Inquisition was actually a relatively weak institution in terms of actually trying people and effectively making changes, but it did have an impact on the ways that people communicated with each other. It had an impact on people's relationships to priests and to religious practices. And I think that I will save some of this for another separate lecture and talk in a little bit more detail. But for now, what I'm trying to depict is that there were some concrete changes in the ways that the church was present that looked very different from how it was in the early 16th century.